Let's talk about the marriage between the mainstream left and the extremists in Antifa. The mainstream media and the establishment left have been covering for Antifa violence for decades. But after Charlottesville, they've started to openly celebrate and glorify it. Of course, in Charlottesville, the targets were predominantly, but in the media shown exclusively, actual white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and KKK members. People with horrible ideas, which makes it easy for people not to care if they get physically attacked. The problem with political violence and terrorism is that if you support it when it's aimed at people you don't like, you just support terrorism as a means, period. The only difference between them attacking people you hate and people you love is perspective. The terror attacks in Charlottesville and Barcelona were just 5 days apart, and in both cases a vehicle was used to overrun pedestrians. In both cases with fatal consequences. However, the treatment of the two cases by the mainstream media is staggeringly, although predictably, different. Charlottesville led to international upheaval, discussions about the right and the far right, implicating just about anyone and everyone right of the political center as guilty parties in the attack. But after Barcelona, just like after all other Islamic terror attacks, the mainstream media go to bizarre extremes not to mention any connection to the obvious motive of the attackers. While they literally shout their convictions and intentions while massacring the innocent, and they have books and people literally telling them to do the things they've done, traditional media outlets manage to fill entire newspapers and entire talk shows without even mentioning the words Islam or Muslim once. Several magazines paint President Trump as a supporter of the KKK or even as a Klansman himself. It's painfully clear how differently they treat the actual inspirations behind Islamic terror attacks, while implicating Trump in something from which he explicitly distanced himself. I sent the New Yorker a more appropriate alternative for their new cover, but I doubt they'll use it. During news broadcasts about the Barcelona attack on both CNN and MSNBC, the question was raised whether this could be a copycat of the Charlottesville attack. Not a copycat of the Nice attack, the Stockholm attack, the London attack, the Berlin attack. No, it had to have been another right-wing extremist. Even though Barcelona was far more similar to those aforementioned Islamic terror attacks. Random victims versus political opponents, random day versus a tense day of violent protests, a big city with many tourists versus an inconspicuous place, a seemingly unplanned act versus a seemingly planned one. After the Manchester terror attack, which claimed 22 lives, the left said don't look back in anger. Not so much after the Charlottesville one. The violent far-left Antifa group, which by any reasonable definition of the word should be considered a terrorist organization, received glowing reports in the mainstream media. Their violence towards non-extreme right-wingers, which has been an ongoing phenomenon for decades now, but intensifying since Donald Trump's candidacy for the White House, has never reached much attention, let alone criticism. But after Charlottesville, they were actually celebrated. Apparently, it doesn't matter that by most accounts, they started the violence that day. Again, their side of the violence hardly even made the news. And when Trump denounced their part in the violence, as well as the far right's, a show of nuance and fairness, he was condemned for not just condemning the people who were attacked first. By refusing to denounce Antifa's violence on that day, the left is deliberately legitimizing their use of violence against political opponents. If the partisanship of the mainstream media was not made clear enough in the aftermath of the Islamic terror attack in Barcelona, it should have been after the Boston Free Speech Rally, which featured no neo-Nazis, no white supremacists, but still led to the left wing's favorite terrorists erupting in violence and attacking the police. The mainstream left praised them, emboldened them, encouraged them. Surprise America, now your mob of left-wing terrorists is out of control. The Charlottesville riot has been greedily taken as an excuse by mainstream news outlets and politicians, even some on the right, to justify Antifa's violence. But this is not an incidental, heat-of-the-moment occurrence. The media have long ago adopted the terminology of the far left, calling them by their own chosen nomer, anti-fascist, which is of course the first thing that makes them sound like an acceptable organization to the casual observer. CNN at least acknowledged Antifa's use of violence at first, but later, at the far left's request, dropped their mention of violence in the headline of an article. This is the shameless open whitewashing of a violent group that has a long history of turning peaceful gatherings into riots, assaulting people, vandalizing public and private property, arson, and much more. Just one of the problems, albeit a very fundamental one, is that these anti-fascists have been allowed to decide for themselves who the Nazis and the fascists are. Especially in the past couple of years, in the new age of political correctness, leftists have been constantly finding new things to be offended by, always trying to outdo one another, discovering wrongthink. In Boston, someone at the left-wing counter-protest was beaten simply for refusing to say that he hates white people. They call this tolerance. You might have liked seeing Nazis getting attacked by Antifa, but it was never just about Nazis. The Boston Free Speech rally on August 19th had nothing to do with Confederate statues. There were no extremists speaking, there was no racism, no white supremacy. It was just a small gathering of right-wingers celebrating free speech in troubled times. The respectable right has been violently attacked by the far left for decades. This is nothing new, and this is why it's a bad idea to support anyone being attacked for their ideas. Many Antifa members openly consider all Trump supporters and voters, i.e. over 60 million Americans, to be racists and fascists. Anyone might be next. Since Antifa has been allowed to decide who the Nazis are, that definition has come to include basically every police officer doing his job and protecting the right to protest of people disliked by Antifa. Who could have expected that from a group where almost every rally, riot, features only several signs that call for the murdering of cops? The use of violence and threats of violence to intimidate people into hiding or abandoning their political views is terrorism, and Antifa, anti-fascist action, and all similar groups by their many names worldwide should be treated as such. If they had any other underlying ideology than leftism, they would have been disbanded long ago. The establishment left has embraced the extremism on their side. They praise terrorism as long as it's in the name of their ideals. But part of the game they play is that they make it impossible for the rational right to criticize the mainstream media's response to Charlottesville without implicating that we are secretly allies of right-wing extremists. I've seen nothing but overt condemnation of the neo-Nazis and the KKK members marching in Charlottesville. I've seen nothing but condemnation of the fatal car attack. And still, it's not enough for the mainstream media. It's not enough for them because they don't care about truth or fact. They are simply out to destroy the right. But the political agenda of the mainstream media is out in the open now, and it's not limited to Antifa. While the tragic photograph of drowned toddler Alan Kurdi was featured on headlines and TV talk shows for days, if not weeks on end back in 2015, they refused to show any image of the victims of Islamic terror attacks. One child killed in Barcelona was photographed in a bone-chillingly similar pose to Alan Kurdi. But we won't see this child on the news the way we saw Alan Kurdi. Why not? Because of the narrative. The establishment narrative of open borders, appeasement of Islam, and crushing the right, crushing nationalism, and moving further towards political globalism. May we never stop exposing their hypocrisy.